underneath all of those initial layers of big thoughts and concerns and neurosis, that there is a sense of peace just waiting to be discovered. That's just who we are. If you do all four of these things in a day, you will have unlimited energy. And these four are eating well, sleeping well, meditating, and exercise. I think a lot of times people feel like, oh, no. Anxiety is just something that's a part of me. It's who I am. That's not true. Anxiety is something that we have learned and something that we can thus unlearn.
So welcome, Lodro.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. So my name is Lodro. I am a longtime meditation teacher. I've been teaching meditation for about 20 or so years now, having grown up in a Buddhist household and then started meditating when I was a kid, and then starting to do teacher trainings back when I was 18 years old, and I'm in my late 30s now. So along the way, have written a handful of books. The first one being The Buddha Walks into a Bar, came out in 2012. And then the most recent one just came out this year, which is Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times. So sort of me in a nutshell.
Yeah, you've written 7 books. The Buddha Walks into the Bar, I've seen is highly acclaimed, has been very popular, bestseller for those that
Yeah, it's
haven't.
always interesting when you do a book and then, you sort of revisit 10 years later. And it's, I remember being stuck on some chapters and being like, oh, well, this YouTube clip is really popular right now, so I can reference that. And of course, I don't think anyone remembers the honey badger clip from 2011 or whatever it was that came out. But, I think the book still has some relevance and people still seem to enjoy it, which is great.
I think today, as we discussed, we're probably going to talk a little bit about anxiety. It fits in nicely with your new book that's been launched, especially within the times we're in. We were just talking just before we started recording about here in India and New York in terms of what it's like with COVID. Has anxiety played a big part of what's going on now and how people feel? Absolutely.
Yes, that's a great question. And, I think part of, I was working on this book and then it was expedited. I sort of was like, I got to get this out now because the pandemic came crashing down around us. I remember very clearly a few weeks into March 2020, people coming to me, a lot of people who had been, sort of teaching meditation to for some time would say, so when do you think this is going to be over? And as if I somehow would have some great scientific background that they've never realized and I've been hiding from them. Of course, I would always say, I don't know. But then my pivot would always be, maybe this is an interesting opportunity for us to get comfortable with not knowing. And that's the hard part for so many people. A lot of the anxiety that has risen around the last year and a half or so has been, I don't know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And in absence of knowing what's going to happen, I'm going to tell myself a lot of stories about what could happen. I'm going to play out every scenario that could possibly occur, whether that is what's going to happen around my job, my living situation, when I can go back to hugging my family, when I can even see my family, any of these sorts of things, because we have not known. And, I think in many cases, it's still uncertain, even here where things have, I'm in New York and there are a lot of people who've been able to get vaccinated. And at the same time, there are a lot of more shifting, both varieties of the COVID virus coming our way and also shifting guidelines around it. And people are still uncertain what is going to happen. And that's even a pretty privileged position to be in compared to other places, at least here in the States, in the South, of course, where you are in India. There's still so much unknown. What is going to happen? When will vaccines be available? What will that look like? It's deeply nerve-wracking and rightfully so. But when we are faced with something like that, when I said earlier, could we get used to the not knowing? It's an interesting exercise in saying how much is the suffering that's happening right now just suffering, and how much am I reinforcing and holding myself in these stories that are causing me pain? And maybe I should just offer an example from the book, which is, there's an old Buddhist analogy called the 2 arrows. You're walking through a forest and out of nowhere, an arrow comes and hits you in the arm. Okay. And what we should do, obviously, is take that arrow out, even begin to tend to our own healing. But ultimately, what we end up doing, many of us, is to say, oh my God, who shot me? I bet it was so and so. It's always so typical that I'm the one that's going to get shot. This is just the way that things are for me. This is just the way that my life is. So and so at work never gets shot. It's always me. And those stories that we start telling ourselves are what are known as the second arrow. So,
Okay.
arrow number one, there is suffering as part of life. Arrow number two, we then perpetuate that suffering with all of the stories that keep us locked in that state. And that's where we have some real control. Unfortunately, we do not have definitive control over all of the aspects of what are happening around the pandemic, in our life, in the economy, and so on. But we do have some ability to work with our mind to control the number of stories that we hold ourselves in pain around. Does that distinction make sense?
I believe so. Yeah. So it's taking control of, taking accountability, from what I understand from that, and
Yeah.
not letting outside things control you. Taking control of what's in your control, rather than the things that are outside of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like, no matter what happens in our life, it could be joyous, it could be stress inducing. We have this tendency to perpetuate, well, what if this happens? What if that happens?
Yeah.
For example, it could be something very simple, like someone says, hey, I want to talk to you tomorrow. And you could sit there and say, oh, well, I haven't caught up with them for a while. Maybe it's just that. Or you could say, maybe they think that I did something horribly wrong and they need to reprimand me. Maybe we're in a fight. I don't even know. And you could spend hours telling yourself stories about how this conversation is going to go.
Yeah.
It's not actually helpful. You show up and it's probably something else that you never even thought about. They said,
Mm.
hey, I want to pick your brain. You told me that you were, working on this thing. I'm working on something similar. How do you do it? Like it could be so benign and so different than what we thought. And yet we waste many, many hours mentally holding ourselves in a state that is not actually one of presence or joy. And
Mm.
that's the pain of it all. That's
Yeah.
where we can actually get to, as you said, work with our minds.
Yeah.
Or as the book title says, take back our minds. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good point. I like what you said there about, because I, even in my professional life, that happens so often. Oh, I need to catch up with you about something. You might not explain exactly what it is, because it might just be in the moment, and there might not be a lot of detail to it. And I know from speaking to people, people panic. There's panic there. It's like, oh, what do you want to talk about? It's like, well, yeah, it's straight away. That's almost the initial reaction a lot of the time, rather than, okay, great, yeah, I look forward to the conversation. There
Yeah.
is a state of panic there. What do you believe causes that? What's kind of helped that fester in people, in us?
Yeah. I mean, I think from an evolutionary point of view, we have this bit of a negativity bias where the mind tends to skew into negative directions if we don't know how to work with it. And then we also have this whole fight, flight, freeze
Yeah.
response mode that's been honed over generations and generations, centuries really, um, where, the classic example is we have been trained that if we see a saber-toothed tiger, we have this physiological response. We either want to fight against it, run away from it, or do we just freeze and
Mm.
go numb? And that at the time was probably pretty helpful to keep us alive. But by the very nature of technology and the world just speeding up around us, our brains are still at the point where they cannot really tell the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and an angry email from our boss. And that's the pain of the matter, where we get this email, maybe it's not even angry, it's just a little confusing and maybe a little curt, let's say. And we say, oh my gosh, they're mad at me, I'm going to lose my job, and I won't be able to pay my rent, and we freeze up, or we start getting really angry, want to fight and type an angry email back to them, or we run away and we escape down a bottle or pop a pill or whatever. It's just this like initial stress response, we can say, is
Mhm.
something that might arise. But then what do we do with our minds when that happens? And could we begin to train the mind in a way that says, oh, I don't have to actually do any of those things. I could acknowledge that occasion and move right back into the rest of my day. And I think the more that we get into the realm of meditation, the more we actually are learning to rewire the brain in that direction. So I'm sort of talking more on the scientific end, but meditation itself does create these new neural pathways that instead of chasing after all of these stories, as you were just saying, we start to say, I don't have to do that. I can come back to the breath as an example of something we could meditate on. We're sitting there, we're meditating on the breath. And then the same story comes up and we say, oh my gosh, right, I got to do that thing. And we acknowledge it and we come back to the breath again. We could do this 10 times, 100 times in the period of a few minutes. But at the end of the day, we've rewired the brain every single time we acknowledge the thought, chose not to chase after it, and came back to the breath. This helps us so much that when we're going out and we're shopping at the grocery store, that same sort of anxiety producing thought comes up, we are more likely then and more able, having trained the mind in this direction, to acknowledge it and to come right back to the present moment. And that's the beauty of meditation. That's how it helps us rewire and move away from that sort of habitual, if nothing else, response.
Yeah. When you refer to coming back to the breath, is that something that you use in your practice for meditation? For anyone that's listening that is not familiar with meditation.
There are many types of meditation out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I would, just say, the thing about, being a meditation teacher is you run into people at parties and they say, oh yeah, I've done this. And they name something. And at this point I've heard it all, but meditation, sort of a big catch-all phrase. A common definition could just be that we're substituting our discursive thinking, all of the thoughts that we've been talking about today, flitting around, and substituting that for an object of our attention that we keep coming back and refocusing on.
Okay.
So I use the example of the breath, and I'll come back to that in a second. But people also might do a mantra, a phrase that they would say regularly. They might do sound, they might do any number of things that they are refocusing the mind on again and again. They get distracted, they come back. That's meditation. But often when we talk about meditation these days, people are referring to mindfulness meditation. And that comes out of the Buddhist tradition within which I was raised. And it's very, very simple. I mean, it's really 3 steps. We take an uplifted and relaxed posture, whatever that means to us, although there are any number of different ways of doing that. And then we focus on the breath. It's the second point. We just notice the natural cycle of the body breathing. We're sitting here breathing right now. Whoever's listening to this at home will be breathing right then. You're already doing it. We don't have to do anything. We're just relaxing into what's already happening. And then 3, when we do find ourselves distracted, we do what we just mentioned before. We come back to the breath. We acknowledge it. If it's helpful, people could even silently and very gently say to themselves, thinking, just to acknowledge, oh, that's what happened. I drifted off. I was thinking. And then we come right back. So that's really it. You set a timer, you do that for 10 minutes. It's not very complicated. It's not easy to do because we've habituated the mind so frequently to go all over the place, to problem solve. I mean, that's another thing we've evolutionarily been trained to do. We've got to problem solve whatever comes up. We perceive there's this angry or maybe confusing email from the boss. What are the 25 things that I can do about this? Right? That's where the mind goes. Very rare for us to say, no, what I'm going to do is acknowledge this, come back to what I'm currently doing. The water I'm sipping, the walk I'm taking with the dog, whatever it is. I'm actually going to be present with that instead of drifting off again. It's simple, but not easy, let's say.
Yeah. I had a gentleman on one of the first guests I ever had on the podcast about a year ago, Vivek Shetty. He's a yogin. I was speaking to him about this because I was quite open about, although I share in some of my solo episodes where I've written some content and done some research, I know the benefits of meditation. But I also personally struggle with sitting down and finding that solace in my mind for a period of time. I'm very open about that. I'm not going to hide from it. My mind does run at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But the one thing that I find helpful is I like to go for a walk, and I find that meditative to me personally. It might not be a good way of meditate, a real mode of meditation, but for me, I find that somewhere, even though I can kind of, there's things going on around me, most of the places I go for walks personally are quite quiet places. I find that a good space for me personally to kind of unwind, rather than, I suppose sitting down in one spot or focusing on one thing. So I'm sure you'll be able to tell me whether that is not meditation, that is just kind of going for a walk and relaxing, or whether it is.
Yeah. And I'm going to say both the thing of it's not necessarily meditation in the formal sense, but it's relaxing, right? So that's a good thing to do. I think when we talk more generally about self-care, I often point out to people that there's this ancient set of teachings that has been around for thousands of years, hundreds of years, if not thousands, known as the 4 exhilarations. It said, if you do all 4 of these things in a day, you will have unlimited energy. And these four are eating well, sleeping well, meditating, and exercise. And it's so simple. Why was this held secret for so long? But the general way that we live our lives is that we might, for example, sleep in and feel good. Oh, I'm slept enough. And then we say, oh, but I don't have any time then to meditate, or I don't have any time to go to the gym. Or we go to the gym and we say, because I went to the gym, I should eat whatever I want. We eat a lot of junk food. Very rare that we do all four. But I think when we start thinking about the realm of self-care and wellness, to balance these very simple things, all four within a day, is actually really quite profound for many of us. That being said, I think, it is exactly what you said. It is meditative or meditation like to go on and give ourselves time and space to be with ourselves. It could be a walk.
Yeah.
It could be time in a hammock without, any book or your phone. It could just be any number of things that we're sort of giving ourselves space to breathe. We used to, until very recently, have a lot of those moments. Living in New York City, I would get on a subway, and if I didn't bring a magazine, I would basically just be by myself for that time. Growing up, I would go on long car rides with my family, and they didn't give me things to entertain myself. I just sort of looked out the window. That was just the way things were. We didn't have little pocket devices that would entertain us. So I think, we are missing that time as a society. Many of us don't have as much of just like windows where we are not entertained and not distracted. But then in terms of formal meditation, it is a little bit different in that there's that definition I was using before, that we're sort of repeatedly placing our mind on an object. And it could be, you very well could do walking meditation as a formal practice, which is just slightly different in that we would be present with every step. And when the mind gets distracted, we would come back and be present with that step. That is a very simple and wonderful form of meditation that, even the Buddha talked about 2,600 years ago. So I think that's, it's a slight distinction, but it's sort of one step away from that acknowledgement, and coming back to the physical movement is the only thing that's shifted, making it a formal meditation practice.
I suppose that's something for me to look into the next time I go for a walk, isn't it? Is trying that out as well. Which brings me on to, for people that are listening that, and again, it could be directed at myself, people that haven't done meditation before. I think the way you say it, you make it sound so easy, but like you say, it is difficult. I know it's difficult to kind of just focus on something without anything else coming into your mind. How would you advise somebody to get into meditation and start and be consistent with it? Because if you do it and you kind of like, well, it didn't work, the first time, and then you give up, what small steps you can take to making sure you can do it consistently?
I think that is a great question. I mean, I've got about 10 answers in my head, so I'll try and be concise. If you can work with a live teacher, to work with a live teacher, whether that means attending a class, either live or in person or online. But something that, as you begin to navigate these difficulties, challenges that come with starting anything, whether it's a new musical instrument, a new language, it's sort of helpful for someone in those examples to say, oh, you're holding the instrument wrong, or you're mispronouncing that. Same thing with meditation, that if there's someone there that you can be in dialogue with around whatever emerges as you start to practice, that's really helpful. So that's sort of number one with the bullet. If people don't have access to that, there are a lot of good apps and things like that these days, or you can get resources, even, for people who, for example, wanted to visit my website at lodrorinzler.com, they would find, free guided meditations from me, and you could download those and listen to those. So there's lots of access to meditation these days. I think the important thing is, if you're going to do an app, to find a credible one and reputable one, and same thing with a meditation teacher, if you're going to go straight to their site and get access to their website and to their meditations. For people who are like, okay, I've tried this a few times and I just don't know how to get consistent, which is sort of like the next step. Now that I know what the practice even is, what do I do about it? Sorry, I should say one more thing in the last thing. Either working with a live teacher, doing an app, or books are good too. As the guy who has written 7, I do believe that you can learn how to meditate from a book. And in all of the books, of course, there's detailed meditation instruction. And also, again, I really do think, like, you go onto my website or other teachers' websites that you admire, there's going to be more often than not free guided meditations for you to get you going. But how do we get consistent? Because that was a great question. I'm basically going to say consistency in 4 different ways to maybe make it a little bit more interesting. The first way would be to pick a consistent amount of time. To get going, often I recommend that people would meditate for 10 minutes a day. It doesn't have to be much more than that. Okay. And when we do that, we should set a timer and just say, okay, like when the timer goes off, I'm done. Because otherwise we're looking at our watch every minute being like, is this over yet?
Mhm.
If we have moments where the timer goes off and we feel, oh, that was great, I should do more, I'm going to recommend you just get up and go about your day. There's going to be other times where you say, oh my God, I can't believe it's 10 minutes. It hasn't happened yet. I'm going to jump out through my skin. Keep sitting for 10 minutes. The idea here is not to have good meditation, bad meditation. Any meditation that we do is good meditation. Anytime that we're on the cushion is good. But to suspend that sense of judgment is really important. To not say this is a good session, this is a bad session. It's just a session. 10 minutes
Okay.
is just, yeah.
Yeah. Good or bad, you just get it done. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's sort of a consistent amount of time. Consistent time of day is also really helpful.
Mhm.
Meaning like, oh, I do this as part of my getting up in the morning routine or my evening routine before I go to bed or after work. I put down or my bag or I close my computer and I meditate. And I think that's actually really wonderful. That it just sort of gets baked in the same way that you probably don't think about brushing your teeth and carving out the time for it. It's just there, you do it.
Mhm.
So that's very helpful. Consistent time of day, consistent environment. It doesn't have to be a whole spare room. It could just be, oh, I put a cushion down in the corner. I set a candle up. I set an image of someone that I admire, and that's where I go to meditate. It can be
Mhm.
that simple, but having that space ready and waiting for you is really helpful.
Yeah.
And the last part of consistency I'll mention is just pacing. It said in a lot of the research around positive habit formation, when we do something 11 days in a row, it starts to become habit forming.
Mm.
And that's where it starts to become stickier. So any sort of consistent pacing that we can do is really helpful in this regard.
So let's talk a little bit about your new book. I know you can't tell us everything about the book, but I know you can tell us, I suppose, some of the core pieces that come out of that and what to expect.
So the new book is called Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times. And the core principle here, it's just that so many of us are struggling with anxiety. As I mentioned earlier, particularly during this time of the pandemic, it just seems to have ramped up. It was already a very anxious time. There's been a lot of instability, not just here in the United States, but also abroad. All around the world, there's political instability, there's economic instability, there's climate change. There's a lot of reasons for people to all of a sudden feel like the world is literally and sometimes figuratively on fire. What do we do about that? And we may not be able to solve for everything, but could we at least begin to work with our own mind? And the book really does break out both formal meditation practices, such as working with strong emotions or the practice that I just mentioned of mindfulness of the breath, all the way into on the spot practices. And I think this is one of those areas that over time, I realized this is important that people actually learn, not just, oh, I did a meditation and now I'm done for the day, but that in the other waking hours of our day, we begin to say, oh, I know how to work with my mind.
Yeah.
I catch myself when I'm drifting off in all of these stories and I can interrupt it. I can become inquisitive about the experience. I could take 3 deep breaths in order to actually return to the present moment. There are things that I can do to take back my mind. And the way that I often think about this is if I turn to you and I said, choice, would you rather be stressed out or would you rather be content and happy? Which would you choose?
Content and happy.
Yeah, not surprisingly, this question has a 100% success rate. So it's this thing where it's like, okay, in that moment, we made a choice. Could we begin to train the mind to continue to make that choice? So that when stressful things happen, we don't say, I'm going to hold myself in that state of stress. We say, I'm going to make a different choice. I'm going to return to the present moment long enough to appreciate some of the simple things that are happening right under my nose that could indeed bring about a sense of contentment. And that's a big part of what the book is about, that we take our mind back from that overwhelmingly negative experience of being held in stress and anxiety into something that is actually a little bit more peaceful, calm, and joyous.
It's actually something I was doing not that long ago today with some of my colleagues. We were kind of putting together a new workshop on emotional intelligence. And one of the exercises that I did with the guys was ask them to reflect back on the last 24 hours and to just write down all of the emotions that they felt in the last 24 hours. And that's just something we just never, we rarely do. And the amount of emotions that come up. And I suppose the reason I'm coming to this is a lot of us don't even know some of the emotions that we feel, not consciously anyway. We're not consciously aware the emotions that we run through on a 24-hour basis. it kind of just happens, and then it just, the next day comes, the next day comes, and there's no reflection or introspection of, what I'm doing. And I always find that the first, what we were talking about, is the first step is actually identifying and understanding what emotions you're going through, when they happen, and what it is that you can do, and just being consciously aware of them. And I find that really helpful.
Yeah.
But being anxious, some people don't even know they're going through that emotion.
Yeah.
So having these kind of tools can help.
There's two practices I introduced in the book around this. One being, it's okay to feel this practice, which is not dissimilar from the meditation practice I mentioned before of meditating on the breath. Only here, what we're doing is noticing what emotions are present. So we often will tell ourselves stories like, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's what they're going to do. Here's what I'm going to do. When I drop that story, what emotion is present? Well, maybe there's fear, maybe there's sadness or anger. And could I just be with that experience of the emotion itself? Not try and fix it, not try and solve for it, but to be with the emotion itself. And when we drift off and we start telling ourselves more stories about it, instead of saying thinking like we did before, we would tell ourselves, it's okay to feel this. So we just become mindful of the emotions itself. That becomes the object of our attention in this case. We return to feeling frustration, for example, and we just let ourselves feel the experience of that emotion without layering story after story on top. What happens when we are with our emotions without continuing to perpetuate them with all of these stories? They often shift, change, at the very least become less overwhelming. Often they'll even fade out. It's a little bit like there's a fire burning, a campfire, and we walk up. What we want to do is just hold our hands to the warmth and feel it. And what happens when we do that? It's a perfectly lovely process, and without any fuel, the fire dies down. That's just the nature of the beast. That's the exact idea of this particular style of meditation, to be with the emotions, to see them for what they are, to experience them without continuing to perpetuate them. The perpetuation there is all of the stories. Well, I'm going to tell everyone that they did this, and then they're going to realize that I'm right and this person's wrong. That's like us going up to that campfire and pouring a tank of gasoline on it. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We're keeping ourselves in that perpetual state. So when we let go of the stories and come into just feeling the emotion underneath, it can actually be quite liberating. And the second practice is a practice known as RAIN, which is a short acronym. It's a practice that was developed by the Buddhist teacher Michelle McDonald based on the early teachings of the Buddha, which RAIN stands for recognize, accept or allow, investigate, and nurture, or sometimes it's translated instead as non-attachment or non-identification. But the idea here is that we would be able to recognize whatever emotions are present. And as you said, it could be any number of things. It doesn't have to just be one. It could be multiple layers of emotions. To recognize them and then to do that thing that we just talked about before, which is to allow ourselves some space to feel them, to accept them as they are. And then we can begin to gently become inquisitive and investigate them. And we conclude by sort of letting them go and realizing that they're not who we are. They are part of what's going on right now. It's a very big difference for many people. Instead of saying, I'm an angry person, it's like, no, I have anger right now. I'm feeling some anger right now. It's very different. It's just what's going on in this moment, and what is going on in the next moment is not necessarily that.
I like what you, this part about feeling the emotion, kind of practicing feeling like that emotion, getting used to it. In terms of meditation, are there chances of ever feeling quite negative when you do it? If you go into like a bad spot, I don't know, but is it something that could happen?
Yeah, I think people always like, okay, but what's the downside? Often the downside is that we end up getting bored. We're like, there's better things I could be doing with my time right now. But I had a meditation teacher many years ago who pointed out, if you feel bored during meditation, who is boring? It's you. You're boring yourself. The other sort of downside would be that we start to notice some of the things that we've previously avoided about ourselves. We do, because we're so used to escaping our emotions, we may not recognize that they've been sort of fighting to be heard for quite some time. So it's not that meditation itself unleashes all sorts of brand new horrible emotions. It's just that we might have been so busy distracting ourselves from them, running around, exhausting ourselves so that we don't have to look at ourselves, that when we slow down enough to be just present, we say, oh, there's a lot going on here. So sometimes it feels a little bit like a waterfall of thoughts when we sit down to meditate. But then the more we meditate, it becomes less like an overwhelming waterfall, more like a sort of lazy river that we're riding along. Then as we continue to meditate, we might even be able to put our feet down, and it feels a little bit more like a stream or a babbling brook. It's sort of like the water is going by us, but we're holding our ground. We're just standing there. We're not getting swayed by it.
Yeah.
And it said that, the more and more we do this, the more the mind becomes like a pond without a ripple on it. Just open, deep, clear, pristine. And that's our natural state, that there is this sense of peace and calm that is waiting to be discovered. In fact, a common way that we talk about, we say mindfulness meditation often in the West, but really it comes from, there's many words for it, but in Tibetan Buddhism, we often use the Sanskrit word shamatha, shamatha. And that can be translated as calm abiding or peaceful abiding meditation, implying that underneath all of those initial layers of big thoughts and concerns and neurosis, that there is a sense of peace just waiting to be discovered. That's just who we are. And we could abide in that peace, in that sense of calm, the more we actually get into the practice itself. It just takes a little bit of a learning curve to get there.
In terms of that, in terms of the learning curve with meditation, is there like an average time as you being a teacher? How long do people take to kind of really fall into it and get into it, and without it being, I suppose, difficult? I was explaining about myself. I find it hard to just shut off. And
I'm reminded of a story of a friend and colleague of mine who, having gotten this question many, many times over, he's been teaching for decades upon decades, that he was at some sort of conference and someone said, how long will it take for me to really see the benefits of meditation? And he is not normally this sort of wry person, but he just looked at him for a second and goes, 2 months, and then went on to the next question without even explaining. And I sort of love that, because it's sort of hard to know. It depends. You are a person
how long's a piece of string? Is it one of them?
Was that?
Is it one of those? How long is a piece of string?
Yes, exactly. Right. I've never heard that. This is perfect.
Oh, okay.
It is that. It depends on who it is, and it depends on whether they're living an incredibly overwhelmed life, whether they're living a somewhat peaceful life, how much time do they allow themselves to be with themselves already, essentially. And yet, at the same time, we know through the beauty of science and research around meditation that generally, if people start doing this for a little bit a day, let's say 10 minutes a day, after a period of some 8 weeks or so, they've actually said, oh, look, there are actual changes in the brain. And this is why we get all this research saying, if you meditate for a little bit for these 2 months or sometimes 3 months in these studies, sometimes 10 weeks, you will see ... increased creativity, better sleep patterns, boost your immune system, make you more creative, you name it. It's just, there's all of these ancillary benefits that essentially fall under stress reduction. They are like stress reduction research, which is interesting. I don't love that phrase just because it implies that you no longer have stressful things happen to you. It's like you meditate and you no longer have to pay taxes or whatever. It's not the case.
Yeah.
It's, you still have to deal with your financial situation and your annoying family member and all of it. It's the fact that they feel less annoying and it's less overwhelming to deal with your taxes because you've been able to work with your mind. Your relationship to stress changes. And that's the beautiful thing. So all of these scientific benefits after 8 or so weeks, it's because people have actually learned to work with their mind. So maybe that's a more scientific answer, although I do really think it depends on the person exactly how long. It's less like how long and more like how consistent can we get. So when I mentioned earlier, that sense of pacing, like if we do it 11 days in a row, it starts to become habit forming. The more we do it, the more it just naturally starts to show up in the rest of our lives. And that means that, for example, if we are learning a musical instrument, if I pick up a guitar once a week, at some point I'll learn it a little bit, but it's not like I'm going to be that proficient. If I picked up a guitar just 10 minutes a day, lo and behold, it's one of those situations. It's like I actually progress pretty quickly and it becomes more natural and everything goes a little bit more fluid.
It's the same with anything. You put the time into it. The more time and the effort you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it, and the quicker it's probably going to happen. Some quick tips towards listeners for anxiety, because I think that was one of the bits, wasn't it? And one of the questions, I know, how can we build a better relationship between anxiety and stress?
I'm probably overdue for sort of defining what these terms are, but I want to just sort of briefly delineate between those two, and then yes, I will absolutely offer something
Yeah, yeah.
hopefully helpful.
I'm sure you will.
First is, the sense of stress. Stress here is considered to be your body's reaction to a trigger. It could be, a call from an unknown number or someone saying we need to talk or whatever it is, but it's generally a short-term experience. Whereas anxiety, on the other hand, has been defined as a quote unquote sustained mental health disorder. And by that, it means that, this can arise from a stressful trigger, like the ones I mentioned just now, but it doesn't fade away. It doesn't just go away. Anxiety has both a cognitive element and a physiological response in the form of stress, which means that we experience anxiety in both our mind and our body. So one way to think the distinction between the two is that stress is a response to a threat or a perceived threat at the very least, while anxiety manifests even when there is no clear and present danger, or it has already passed, or we've closed out the email or whatever it might be. So in this way, anxiety keeps us veiled off from the world around us. Like an actual veil, it obscures our vision. We're unable to see beyond whatever's stressing us out that day. So meditation does indeed help us to lift that veil. It's sort of like every time we say, oh, thinking, we come back, we're lifting that veil. I often will say like, okay, number one, we're going to meditate. Please start meditating. And then like 2 chapters in, I'm like, are you meditating? And 5 chapters, I'm like, okay, I'm hoping that you're still meditating. And throughout the book, I also say, and if you're not, here are some other things. So I mentioned earlier getting inquisitive when we notice ourselves spinning out story after story after story. And one of the ways that we can actually do that is to just ask ourselves a simple question. Is this helpful? Or if you prefer, is this useful? And I love that. It's like, well, they're going to say this, and I'm going to say that. Is this helpful? And when we ask ourselves that question, more often than not, the answer will come back, no. It may have been helpful the first time we thought, oh, I should talk to them about this. After the 50th time, it is no longer helpful. So just learning to interrupt those patterns and say, oh, I can cut through by becoming inquisitive, or as I mentioned before, taking 3 deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. It's about 30 seconds or so, but it still is long enough to interrupt the momentum of that anxiety so that we can return to the present moment and start to make better choices coming out of that.
Okay, well, Lodro, any last words of wisdom before we finish today?
I think a lot of times people feel like, oh, no. Anxiety is just something that's a part of me. It's who I am. And that's not true. Anxiety is something that we have learned and something that we can thus unlearn. Yeah. No one was born anxious. We were born with a sense of real confidence, a sense of wholeness, of completeness. And then we were told a lot of stories that actually brought us away from that feeling. And we can unlearn those stories and we can unlearn anxiety. And it does take a little bit of work, but it is actually, at the end of the day, it's what we want to be doing. Because if we have a choice here to actually spend the rest of our life lost in anxiety or to try a different way, why wouldn't we exert ourselves in that different way?
Such a great point. We weren't born anxious. It's just reflecting on some of these things. Like you say, asking yourself the question, do you want to feel like this today? No, I don't. So thank you so much, Lodro. Where could people find you? You did mention your website, and we will put it into the links in the podcast and for those that go onto YouTube. But
yeah, I mean, the nice thing about having a name like Lodro Rinzler is that you get all the domain and social media. So lodrorinsler.com is a good way to be in touch, for sure. That I always answer emails that people send me through that website. And then similarly, Instagram, I'm at Lodro Rinzler, and then Facebook and Twitter as well.
Well, Lodro, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me.